They thought they could scare me out of my own house, but I was already watching every move. The words escaped me the moment I saw it. A crumpled invoice on the marble kitchen counter, damp from a stray coffee spill, $12,400. Paid to some ghost hunting outfit in Glendale. Dated March 2nd, 2022. I held it in my hands, staring at the printed numbers, feeling the cold stab of betrayal pierce me. My own children had plotted this, text messages between them confirmed it. Whispers of candles, ghost sounds, staged orbs, all intended to frighten me into signing over my $3 million Beverly Hills mansion. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. Alice, my youngest daughter, 24, appeared silently in the doorway. Sharp eyes, always noticing what others didn't. She didn't need to ask, she already knew. "Dad, what is it?" Her voice, soft and careful, mingled with the faint creak of the stairs above where my two older children were already plotting their next move. "I found their invoice," I said, sliding it toward her. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her phone, photographing the crumpled edges, zooming on the date and the company logo. "This isn't set enough," she whispered. "We need texts, recordings, anything that proves intent." I scrolled through message threads, capturing screenshots with meticulous care. March 1st, 9:14 p.m. My eldest son texting my daughter, "Tonight's the night. Don't let him see. Candles, whispers, perfect." Alice leaned close, murmuring, "They're clever. They'll stage minor scares first." So it seems believable. And they had small things already. Flickering chandelier lights in the east wing, cold drafts where none should be. Soft whispering caught on the nanny cam, enough to convince anyone else, not me. Gerald, the house manager, appeared in the doorway, tie slightly crooked, tone overly casual. "Everything all right, Mr. Cameron?" His lingering glance betrayed curiosity or collusion. Alice's subtle nod said it all. "Trust no one." I photographed the hallway, stairwell, and kitchen floor where the invoice lay. Every creak under my steps sounded amplified, as if the house itself whispered warnings. I cataloged each piece of evidence: receipts, call logs, texts, odd notes. Every shadow, flicker, and whisper would become part of their undoing. March 3rd, I retrieved the mansion contracts, appraisals of antiques, and bank statements from the safe. Every ledger, every painting, every heirloom tied to my legacy and to the children's intended deception was now part of my arsenal. That night, the mansion breathed around me, wind rattling windows, floorboards groaning, faint whispers echoing through the east wing. I smiled. Let them try. Alice and I were already steps ahead. She set up a command center in the library, laptop open, notebook filled with observations. "We need to anticipate their next move," she said. I nodded. "Then let them feed the story. Every trick, every stage scare, all recorded." Over the next days, I documented everything: crumpled candle wicks, slightly ajar cabinets, receipts mysteriously delivered to my mailbox. Even Gerald's scribbled note to my son, "East Wing, nightfall, whisper low," found tucked into a ledger, undeniable proof of collusion. Each morning, Alice and I reviewed our growing archive folders labeled meticulously. Invoice _030222. Text _planning _030122. Whisper recording _030322. Each file a breadcrumb of their betrayal, each timestamp a step closer to justice. March 7th. I felt a surge of clarity. The mansion, every antique, every document, was now my fortress. The children's staged successes, flickers, whispers, minor scares, were all meticulously recorded. The house manager's interference documented. Every subtle whisper, floor creak, candle flicker, and receipt contributed to a narrative they didn't even realize they were writing their own confession. I walked the grand hallway that night, listening to the mansion sips wooden bones settling. I whispered, "You thought you could scare me, but I've been listening all along. Every step, every whisper, every lie you thought invisible is now part of your undoing." Alice appeared behind me, calm, resolute. "Ready for the next phase?" she asked. I nodded, the thrill of strategy replacing the sting of betrayal. March 8th, arrived like any other day in Beverly Hills, sunlight pouring through ornate windows, dust motes dancing in the light, and the knowledge that the first whisper of betrayal had been captured, and the first seeds of retribution planted. They whispered my name like it was a spell, but every shadow they cast only reflected their own guilt. By March 10th, 2022, the mansion felt alien to me. I had walked these halls for decades. Yet now every ornate rug, every polished banister, every antique vase seemed charged with deception. The betrayal cut deeper than any chill in the East Wing. My two older children, 28 and 25, had mastered the art of subtle terror, flickering lights, faint whispers, cold drafts strategically placed near priceless heirlooms. They believed these minor successes made the hoax convincing. They were right, anyone else would have believed them. But I wasn't anyone else. Alice and I moved quietly through the halls. She carried her notebook, documenting even the smallest details, a slightly tilted painting, a candle still smoldering despite the night having passed, a faint scuff on the Persian rug where no foot should have stepped. I snapped photographs and recorded audio, layering our evidence like brushstrokes in a courtroom-ready canvas. The house manager, Gerald, hovered nearby with his usual subtlety, delivering innocuous updates while clearly feeding them snippets of insider knowledge. Alice noticed it before I did, the way his eyes darted, the way he lingered just long enough to seem helpful without overt involvement. Every misstep, every shared detail was another thread in their unraveling. I wandered into the library, running my fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes. The sound of creaking floorboards echoed behind me, my children rehearsing lines, whispering to each other, confident in their small triumphs. I pressed record on my phone, capturing their whispered scheming, each syllable, each inflection, a testament to intent. March 11th brought a small disaster for them. I noticed a faint wax stain on the rug near the East Wing chandelier, careless placement of one of their props. Alice photographed it from multiple angles. "They're starting to slip," she said quietly. "Minor errors now will cascade later. We just need patience." I walked through the sunroom, feeling the weight of my antiques, the Fabergé eggs, the original oil paintings, the silverware engraved with my late wife's initials. Every heirloom, every ledger, every artifact was tied to my legacy. Their staged hauntings were not just threats to my sanity, they were attacks on decades of memories and financial planning. My children didn't understand that fear, when carefully documented, could be transformed into proof of intent. That evening, I compiled the evidence in chronological folders. March 1st, 3, minor hauntings, March 4th, 6, documented conversations and creaking floors, March 7th, 9, manager interference and overlooked details. I was constructing a timeline so precise that by the time I revealed it publicly, there would be no room for denial. Audio cues became crucial. The soft rustle of papers in the study, footsteps on the hardwood floor, whispers floating from the East Wing, they all built a rhythm of tension. I could feel the mansion itself participating in the narrative, each sound marking a point in the children's escalating panic. Alice and I would pause, listening to every floorboard groan, noting it in our ledger. March 10th, 7:42 p.m. Footsteps above library, coinciding with whispered instructions. By March 12th, the children were growing bolder, staging minor hauntings with more confidence. A chandelier swayed ever so slightly in the dining hall when no draft existed, lights flickered in precisely the right sequence, and faint shadow projections appeared near family portraits. Yet every act of deception left traces. Alice captured one particularly telling moment. My eldest son stepping out of sight to whisper instructions to the manager, glancing back nervously. That nervous glance, recorded on my phone, would later speak volumes. Nightfall brought the kind of silence that magnified every sound. The wind rattled the windows, casting elongated shadows across the floor. I could hear distant thumps, perhaps a dropped prop, perhaps the children adjusting to their own anxiety. I paused to record, labeling it East Wing Ambient, March 12th, 10:17 p.m. Evidence didn't require dramatics. It required patience. March 13th arrived with renewed tension. Gerald's presence had grown more suspicious, subtle gestures and hints to the children now accompanied by a faint smirk I caught in the corner of my eye. Alice reminded me, document everything. He may try to mask it as helpful, but his loyalty is compromised. I smiled inwardly. Each subtle interference, each whispered tip, was now a thread I could pull at the right moment. My own emotional struggle was real. Walking through rooms filled with my late wife's belongings, hearing children whisper conspiracies about my sanity, I felt despair flare, yet alongside it grew a controlled resolve. Revenge isn't born from blind anger, it's born from clarity, strategy, and patience. Every receipt, every flicker, every recorded whisper was a step toward justice. By the end of March 14th, the mansion was a labyrinth of observation. Cameras, my phone recordings, Alice's notes, receipts, and timestamps, all converging into a meticulously layered map of betrayal. I could trace every movement, every whispered instruction, every staged prop, and every subtle hint from the manager. Their small victories were already turning into their undoing. One moment stands out. Walking past the grand staircase, I heard the faintest whisper, my children rehearsing lines for some phantom encounter. I pressed my hand to the banister, feeling the smooth polish beneath my fingers, thinking how irony would taste when all this was revealed. They imagined terror. They hadn't realized that every sound, every step, and every shadow was being captured to ensure that their fear would ultimately be their confession. Alice appeared beside me as I lowered the phone. "They think they're scaring you," she said, "but every move they make is evidence." I nodded, feeling a rare smile spread across my face. March 15th, 2022. The mansion slept under the soft glow of spring sunlight, a fortress of secrets, evidence, and moral clarity. Shadows had begun to shift in their favor. My favor. And as I walked toward the library, past the grand piano where my late wife Sips's hands once rested, I whispered softly, almost to the walls themselves. They believe these halls are haunted, but the only thing they Sip awakened is justice. They thought they were orchestrating fear, but every step they took was being filmed, documented, and archived for their own undoing. March 10th, 12/20/22. Those days were critical. I knew that for revenge to be both satisfying and irrefutable, the children had to be allowed to believe they were succeeding. Their minor hauntings, carefully staged whispers, flickering lights, they needed credibility, but behind the scenes, a meticulous plan was unfolding. Alice and I had decided to bring in a documentary crew, 3 professionals, discreet, experienced in capturing real-time reactions without influencing behavior. Hidden cameras were installed throughout the mansion, east wing corridors, library, dining hall, and even the small conservatory. Every corner where the children staged tricks was covered, every angle providing audio and visual clarity. Alice monitored them in real time from the library command center, her eyes scanning screens as my children moved unknowingly through their own trap. On March 10th, I sat in the library with the crew, whispering instructions. No intervention unless they cross physical boundaries. Let them perform their illusions naturally. Every whisper, every creak, every look must be captured authentically. I handed Alice a small notebook. Timestamp everything. Footsteps, shadows, props. The more precise, the stronger the evidence. The children didn't suspect a thing. That evening, the chandelier in the dining hall flickered exactly as they had practiced. I pressed record on the hidden audio device in the east wing, catching the faint murmurs of my daughter trying to imitate ghostly voices. The manager, Gerald, was in his usual position, lingering just long enough to appear helpful, while inadvertently feeding the footage with his subtle smirks and whispered instructions. Alice caught a glimpse on the monitor. He handed a folded note to my son while glancing toward the hidden cameras, completely unaware that the lenses were documenting his every action. March 11th arrived with heightened stakes. The children had grown bold, attempting a minor scare near the grand staircase. A candle placed precariously began to tilt, producing a shadow that danced across the wall. The oldest whispered, "She'll see it now, she has to." I quietly moved behind a curtain, capturing both their excitement and the misalignment of the candle. A tiny mistake, but a crucial one. Alice immediately flagged it. Timestamp 7:42 p.m., East Wing. Misaligned prop. perfect. I realized then that the mansion itself had become a stage and an accomplice. Floorboards creaked under deliberate weight, faint drafts swirled in corridors, and soft whispers echoed from the stairwell. Every environmental cue was being catalogued, layered with photographic and audio evidence. By now, minor successes my children thought they'd earned were becoming their undoing, leaving a trail of documented mistakes. March 12th brought the first undeniable proof of Gerald's interference. Alice noticed a folded scrap of paper fall from his pocket as he bent to adjust a chandelier. Written in his unmistakable handwriting, East Wing, whisper low, shadow near painting. I photographed it immediately, recording both the object and the timestamp in our ledger. Alice's eyes met mine. This seals it. Collusion documented. Throughout these days, I meticulously coordinated with the documentary crew. Every angle, every shadow, every prop was mapped. The crew whispered quietly when needed, capturing real-time reactions while remaining invisible. Their footage was pristine. My children fully convinced of their staged haunting, Gerald unwittingly providing evidence, and the mansion itself lending its ambient eeriness. Soft creaks, wind-rattling windows, faint footsteps in empty corridors. I also began arranging my financial evidence concurrently. Bank slips, receipts for props, and previous invoices were aligned with the events captured on camera. Minor payments my children made to the fake ghost hunting company were juxtaposed with timestamps from the hidden footage. Each sequence became airtight: motive, action, evidence, and exposure. One particularly telling moment occurred in the conservatory on March 12th at 9:18 p.m. My eldest son crouched to whisper instructions, glancing nervously toward the hidden camera as if sensing something unseen. The candlelight flickered, shadows danced across the wall, and Gerald hovered nearby, attempting to appear casual. The documentary crew captured the entire sequence, Alice marking every second in her notebook. Timestamp 9:18 p.m. Conservatory. Son instructs, manager observes. Error in candle placement, shadow misaligned. By the afternoon, I could feel the narrative solidifying. My children's staged successes were now threads woven into a tapestry of undeniable proof. Each whisper, creak, and minor misstep was meticulously recorded. The mansion, the shadows, the props, all were silent witnesses to the betrayal unfolding under its roof. Alice remained my anchor, her calm precision contrasting with my simmering, controlled rage. "They think they're creating fear," she said. "But every moment is feeding the story that will unmask them." I nodded, sipping whiskey quietly, watching the mansion respond around me. The soft wind rattling a window, the subtle groan of floorboards, the faint echo of footsteps upstairs. All cinematic, all perfect for the eventual reveal. By the evening of March 12th, I was ready to move toward the next phase, aligning every piece of audio, visual, and financial evidence for the ultimate confrontation. Minor mistakes from the children, documented collusion from Gerald, and my own careful orchestration had created a narrative that was legally, morally, and emotionally airtight. As I walked through the grand hallway, past the Fabergé eggs and silverware engraved with my late wife's initials, I whispered softly, "Every step you took, every shadow you cast is being recorded. Every lie you thought invisible is now a confession." Alice appeared behind me, her presence steady and reassuring. "Ready for the next phase?" she asked. I nodded. March 13th would begin the next stage of calculated tension, the period I called fraying nerves. And as the mansion settled under the early spring night, wind rattling windows, shadows stretching long across the polished floors, I realized something profound: they were performing their own undoing, completely unaware that the only fear being orchestrated was the fear of exposure, real, undeniable, and morally just. They thought they were in control, but every misstep they made tightened the noose around their own deception. March 13th, 2022. The mansion had shifted from familiar home to labyrinth of tension. My children, emboldened by their minor early successes, were now on edge, each flicker of light, each creak of a floorboard, twisting their confidence into anxiety. Every whisper, every staged shadow had been meticulously documented, yet they had no idea that their triumphs were already being rewritten into evidence of their guilt. Alice and I moved like shadows ourselves, observing without interfering. She sat in the library command center, laptop screens glowing softly, headphones capturing every audio cue. The mansion's ambient noises, the subtle draft that rattled windows, floorboards groaning under deliberate weight. The soft whisper of curtains were now allies, amplifying tension while feeding the narrative we were building. March 13th, mid-afternoon, a minor catastrophe for them. My eldest son attempted to stage a floating candle near the dining hall. He had placed it precariously, as he had rehearsed countless times. But this time it tilted too quickly, casting an unnatural shadow across a priceless painting. Alice captured it immediately. March 13th, 3:42 p.m. Candle misaligned, shadow too sharp. Evidence logged. My children panicked quietly, unaware that every flicker and movement was being recorded by hidden cameras. Gerald, the house manager, tried subtle interference again. He whispered instructions to my son, apparently helpful, but each act of complicity was captured in our documentation. Alice flagged a particularly telling moment. He slid a note toward my son while glancing toward a hidden camera. Timestamp 4:15 p.m. Manager collusion, child unaware, she whispered. Perfect. The children's paranoia escalated by the evening. They began checking rooms repeatedly, touching objects, whispering, glancing at shadows. Minor mistakes piled on minor mistakes. One candle had been placed too close to the drapery in the conservatory, causing a small smolder and a startled gasp. Hidden microphones recorded everything. The flustered voices, the hurried footsteps, the hushed apologies to each other. March 14th brought another revealing moment. My daughter tried to create an orb in the east wing using reflective glass and dim lighting. But the alignment was slightly off, creating an unnatural glare. The audio captured her muttering, "It's not right. It doesn't look real." I photographed the setup immediately, noting every detail in our ledger. This was the subtle shift I needed. Their anxiety was growing, their overconfidence turning into exposure. Alice and I reviewed footage late that night. Every shadow, every flicker, every misstep was catalogued chronologically. March 13th, dining hall candle. March 14th, conservatory orb. March 15th, misplaced props in the library. The mansion itself had become a silent witness. Every creak, every draft, every faint whisper adding weight to our narrative. On March 15th, I walked through the grand hallway, my footsteps deliberate. The mansion seemed to echo my controlled resolve, the floorboards amplifying my quiet presence. I paused near the staircase, listening to their whispers above. My eldest son fretted about a misplaced prop, while the younger attempted to console him, both unaware that their every word was being recorded. Alice whispered in my ear, "They're starting to unravel. Their anxiety is feeding us perfect evidence." Even Gerald began to show cracks. Subtle signs, hesitation, glances toward cameras, almost imperceptible smirks, revealed his complicity was not without awareness of exposure. Each gesture, each whispered instruction, was now framed as evidence of conspiracy rather than help. March 16th, early morning, I entered the east wing and noticed a faint wax stain on the Persian rug, a candle that had been handled incorrectly, minor but significant. Alice photographed it, labeling it precisely. March 16th, 7:05 a.m. Candle misplacement, east wing. Traced to eldest son. I smiled quietly. Every small failure accumulated into an irrefutable mosaic. Audio cues throughout these days were critical. The soft whispering of my children rehearsing lines, the faint shuffle of their shoes on hardwood, the subtle rattle of doors closing too slowly, all captured. Each sequence added dimension to their unraveling, evidence layered over the timeline we had carefully constructed. By March 16th evening, the mansion had become a stage for their growing paranoia. Candles misaligned, props mishandled, whispers overlapping, each act leaving a breadcrumb trail. Alice and I cataloged every detail, cross-referencing with receipts, timestamps, and prior footage. Minor successes that had once bolstered their confidence now served to accelerate their exposure. That night, I walked past the conservatory, candlelight flickering softly on the polished floors. My children's whispered fears echoed faintly from the upper corridors. I pressed a hand to the banister, listening intently, thinking how irony would taste when all was revealed. They had believed they were manipulating me. In reality, they were setting themselves up for the perfect moral and legal exposure. Alice joined me silently, her presence steady and reassuring. They think they're scaring you, she said. But every move they make is being recorded and documented. Their own fear will betray them. I nodded, savoring the controlled patience I had cultivated. March 16th ended with the mansion steeped in quiet tension, shadows lingering unnaturally, creaks amplifying the atmosphere, and my children unknowingly performing their own undoing. I whispered softly to myself, almost to the mansion itself. Every step you take, every whisper, every shadow your own creation will be your downfall. Alice's eyes met mine, her calm resolve matching my own strategic patience. We had entered the phase I called fraying nerves, where deception and anxiety began converging perfectly into evidence. The stage was set, the trap fully prepared, and every small mistake had been captured. The mansion exhaled around us, the soft wind rattling windows, shadows stretching long across polished floors, faint echoes of footsteps. I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that justice, measured and morally grounded, was quietly assembling itself within the walls of my home. They thought they had the upper hand, but the closer they came to success, the more airtight their undoing became. March 17th, 2022. By now, every creak, every flicker, every whispered line my children staged had been meticulously documented. The mansion, once merely a home, had transformed into a silent courtroom, walls recording each misstep, shadows echoing with unintended confessions. I could almost feel the tension vibrating in the polished floors beneath my shoes. Alice and I moved deliberately, orchestrating observation with precision. She monitored the screens, highlighting minor errors, cataloging each moment. March 17th. Chandelier flicker at 8:03 p.m. March 18th. East wing whisper misaligned with candlelight. March 19th. Manager's subtle tip to son incorrectly executed. Each minor slip was a thread I would eventually pull to unravel the entire hoax. The children's paranoia peaked during this period. On March 17th evening, the eldest attempted a staged orbs phenomenon in the library. The candlelight reflected off a crystal vase, producing a shadow that he believed was convincing. But the placement was slightly off, causing the shadow to wobble unnaturally. Hidden cameras captured both his excitement and immediate frustration. Alice photographed the setup, noting timestamp 7:42 p.m. library orb misalignment. Child unaware of capture. Gerald, ever the subtle villain, continued to interfere. He whispered instructions to my children while attempting to remain helpful in plain sight. Yet every move was caught on video. March 18th afternoon, he slid a note under my son's hand with advice on shadow placement. Glancing toward the hidden camera, Alice flagged it immediately. Timestamp 2:31 p.m. Manager collusion, child unwittingly compliant. Perfect. Meanwhile, I began aligning financial evidence with visual and audio documentation. Receipts for fake ghost hunter fees, payments to props suppliers, and minor expenditures by my children were cross-referenced with timestamps from footage. Each ledger entry, each bank slip, reinforced the timeline, motive, opportunity, execution. The more they thought they were succeeding, the stronger the narrative became against them. March 19th evening brought a subtle crescendo. My daughter attempted to recreate a whispering effect, using an audio device she had purchased secretly. The timing was off, producing an unnatural echo. Hidden microphones captured her muttering, "It's not right, Dad will notice." I noted it immediately, labeling the clip, March 19th, 8:15 p.m., misfired audio setup, daughter. Even in their small victories, they betrayed themselves. By March 20th, the mansion was a tension-filled labyrinth. Every object, every sound, every shadow was a witness. Alice and I reviewed footage from the prior 3 days, compiling a detailed dossier. Each timestamp, each audio cue, each minor error, and every subtle collusion of Gerald was logged meticulously. My children's staged successes, candles, shadows, whispers, minor orbs, were all converting into evidence of intent. One particularly telling incident occurred on March 20th late afternoon. My eldest son attempted to stage a shadow across the grand piano, The alignment was slightly off. The shadow stretched unnaturally across the polished keys. Gerald whispered instructions nearby, unaware the hidden camera captured his every gesture. Alice flagged the footage, timestamp 4:47 p.m. piano hall, shadow misalignment, manager complicit. This would later be critical proof not only of the children's intent, but also of the insider's participation. Emotional tension ran high. Walking through rooms filled with my late wife's antiques, hearing whispers of betrayal echo through the corridors, I felt the sting of their audacity. Yet alongside it grew a controlled, strategic patience. Revenge isn't born from anger alone. It requires timing, evidence, and moral clarity. I let them believe they were ahead, letting their paranoia escalate while every misstep was catalogued, time-stamped, and photographed. That evening, Alice and I discussed the final storyboard of evidence for the upcoming reveal. "They're unraveling exactly as planned," she said, pointing to timelines and cross-reference clips. "Every minor success feeds the narrative. By the time we expose them, it will be undeniable." I nodded, feeling the familiar thrill of calculated control. The mansion had become a living archive, and every corner held a secret waiting to testify. March 20th night, I walked the grand hallway alone, listening to the mansion breathe. The wind rattled windows, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and faint whispers echoed from the east wing. I pressed a hand to the banister, noting the vibrations of the old wood, imagining how each recorded sound would later reinforce the story. Their staged hauntings had become their own undoing, feeding into a carefully layered narrative. Alice appeared beside me silently, her laptop tucked under her arm. "They don't know that every step, every whisper, every mistake is building their confession," she said softly. I smiled. "Exactly. They're performing their own exposure, and every second of anxiety, every small error is another thread in the noose." By the end of March 20th, the noose had tightened. Minor scares became mistakes, subtle collusions became proof, and the children's overconfidence had turned into a compounding series of errors. The mansion was ready to serve as a stage for truth. My careful orchestration, Alice's precise documentation, and the documentary crew's hidden lenses had created an irrefutable archive. Every whisper, creak, flicker, shadow, and receipt had been transformed into evidence. As I gazed out over the estate under the fading spring light, I realized that the children were not just performing a hoax, they were unknowingly scripting their own downfall. Gerald's collusion, captured silently on camera, added the final layer. I whispered softly, almost to the walls themselves. "You thought fear would make me yield, but the fear you orchestrated, the fear of exposure, is yours alone, and it's perfectly documented." March 20th ended with the mansion steeped in tension, shadows stretching long across polished floors, and the knowledge that every piece of evidence was ready. The stage for Spring Gala and the eventual public reveal was perfectly set. The trap had been laid, and the noose was tightening, thread by careful thread. They didn't realize that calm can be the deadliest kind of trap. March 21st, 2022. The mansion seemed to hold its breath. Every corridor, every polished floorboard, every antique was poised in quiet anticipation. My children, confident in their staged hauntings, had no idea that the ultimate revelation was approaching. They had performed, whispered, and plotted with precision, yet all their efforts had been feeding the archive of evidence I now held. Alice and I moved like orchestrators behind the scenes, ensuring that the mansion itself was aligned with our plan. Cameras were adjusted, audio capture refined, and every room was scrutinized for potential missteps. Even the ambient sounds, the faint wind rattling the windows, the soft groan of aging floorboards, the gentle flicker of candlelight were coordinated to amplify tension while remaining undetectable to my children. March 21st afternoon, the children attempted a minor poltergeist effect in the dining hall. A carefully balanced chair tipped slightly, producing a soft clatter. Hidden cameras caught it perfectly. Alice documented the timestamp, angle, and audio cue. March 21st, 3:18 p.m. East Dining Hall. Chair displaced, child unaware of cameras. Gerald, as always, hovered with subtle interference, whispering instructions, unaware that his every gesture was now proof of collusion. The mansion had become a stage, each sound a note in the symphony of their own exposure. I walked quietly through the library, fingers trailing over spines of my leather-bound volumes, savoring the irony. They thought they were staging fear. In truth, they were laying the groundwork for their own public unmasking. March 21st evening, my children's paranoia began to subtly crack. The eldest murmured about shadows moving in ways he hadn't anticipated. The youngest fretted over misaligned props in the conservatory. Every whispered worry, every hesitant glance was captured. Alice flagged a particularly telling snippet, March 21st, 8:57 p.m. Daughter checking candle placement, anxiety visible. Timestamp logged, their confidence was beginning to fray. Just as I had anticipated, I also reviewed the financial side meticulously. Receipts, invoices, and bank slips were aligned with the footage, creating an unbroken chain of proof. Every payment to the fake ghost hunting company, every purchase for props, every minor expense was now part of a chronological narrative that would become irrefutable. March 22nd brought the final phase before exposure preparation for the spring gala reveal. I walked room by room, ensuring the mansion was stage ready. Shadows were tested, lighting calibrated, audio feeds verified. The subtle creak of the floorboards, the ambient whisper of wind, and even the faint echo of distant birdsong contributed to the tension without alerting my children. Each element was designed to heighten the cinematic atmosphere while feeding evidence. Alice and I reviewed the storyboard for the reveal. Everything is synchronized, she said, pointing to monitors displaying overlapping footage, children staging minor hauntings, Gerald's subtle instructions, misaligned props, whispers, and flickers of candlelight. By the time we show this publicly, no one will question intent. It's airtight, I nodded, savoring the controlled anticipation. Every small victory my children had imagined for themselves had become a thread in the noose. That night, the mansion fell into a profound silence. Even the shadows seemed to pause, long and still across polished floors and heirloom-laden rooms. I stood near the grand staircase, listening to the faintest echoes of my children rehearsing lines upstairs. Each footstep, each whispered instruction, each anxious glance was being captured, catalogued, and time-stamped. The mansion itself had become a co-conspirator in my plan, silently recording every detail for the moral and legal reckoning to come. The calm was almost tangible, a deliberate lull before the storm. Alice joined me, her expression resolute. "This silence, it's perfect," she whispered. "They think they're in control, but the truth is waiting." I smiled quietly, savoring the moment. Patience, I had learned over the decades, was the most potent weapon. Their own overconfidence and subtle missteps had set the stage for ultimate exposure. I reflected briefly on the moral clarity of the plan. Revenge is not cruelty. It is setting boundaries, establishing justice, and letting truth speak for itself. Every small misstep by the children, every subtle interference by Gerald, every minor scare was being transformed into evidence of intent without ever resorting to manipulation beyond observation. By March 22nd evening, everything was ready. Cameras aligned, audio feeds verified, timestamps logged, financial evidence cross-referenced. My children were growing increasingly nervous, unaware that the calm around them was a carefully constructed illusion. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of candlelight would soon contribute to a public unmasking that was inevitable. As I walked through the mansion under the soft glow of spring twilight, the polished floors reflecting the last rays of sun, I whispered softly, almost to the walls themselves, "You thought control was yours, but control is an illusion, and the only fear you've created that matters is the fear of exposure, and it is already yours." Alice's presence beside me was steady, grounding. "Tomorrow," she said, "every single move, every small mistake, every piece of evidence will converge. The audience will see what we've known all along." I nodded, savoring the anticipation. The mansion exhaled around us. The faint whistle of wind, the creak of distant floorboards, shadows stretching long across antique-laden corridors. Every element had been aligned for the spring gala showdown. And in that perfect, eerie calm, I realized the truth. Revenge isn't in the chaos. Revenge is in the control, in the patient orchestration, in the slow tightening of evidence until the moment arrives when deception unravels on its own. March 22nd ended with the mansion steeped in tension, shadows lengthened across polished floors, and my children blissfully unaware that their every move had sealed their own fate. They thought the gala was just another performance, but it was the stage for their own undoing. March 23rd, 2022. The mansion sparkled in spring twilight, chandeliers casting delicate reflections across polished floors. Every room had been meticulously prepared for the spring gala, and every guest had been carefully invited, family, friends, neighbors, and a few of the estate's most trusted associates. But no one knew the true performance about to unfold. Not the children, not Gerald, not even the most skeptical observers. Alice and I arrived early. She carried the final storyboard, detailing the sequence of revelations, audio evidence, video clips, invoices, receipts, timestamps, and documented collusion. Every piece perfectly aligned. "Everything is in place," she whispered, eyes glinting with anticipation. "Tonight the truth will speak for itself." I nodded, savoring the precise orchestration of what I called the dinner of truth. My children, convinced of their own control, mingled nervously in the east wing. Gerald hovered near them, attempting to maintain an air of composure. Their confidence, which had survived minor errors and small scares, was now beginning to crack under the weight of subtle pre-show cues. A chandelier flickered unexpectedly, a soft whisper of wind rattled the windows, and the shadows cast by candlelight stretched unnaturally along the corridors. They glanced around nervously, unaware that every sound, every flicker, and every shadow was documented. Guests arrived in waves, oblivious to the tense undercurrent. I greeted them warmly, masking the calculated anticipation that coursed beneath my calm demeanor. Each step, each gesture was deliberate. Alice positioned herself discreetly among the screens displaying the hidden cameras, ensuring that every angle of the children's behavior was captured. The mansion itself seemed to participate, echoing footsteps, amplifying whispers, and reflecting light in perfect cinematic alignment. The dinner commenced with polite conversation, clinking glasses, and soft music. My children were seated near the center, their eyes darting nervously as the first cues were triggered. A subtle flicker of candlelight in the library corridor, a creak from the east wing floorboards, a faint, disembodied whisper, all captured, all feeding the narrative of exposure. I decided to begin with financial evidence. As the first course was served, I discreetly projected a series of images on a hidden screen in the library. Invoices from the Glendale Ghost Hunting Company, totaling $12,400, appeared sequentially alongside photographs of receipts and timestamps from their purchases. My eldest froze. He glanced at the images, realizing that his meticulous planning had been cataloged, recorded, and prepared for public display. Alice whispered into my ear. "They're beginning to grasp it." I nodded subtly, letting the tension mount. The children's minor successes, the tilted candles, the flickering lights, the carefully staged orbs were no longer victories. They were pieces of undeniable proof. Next came audio evidence. Hidden microphones captured every whispered instruction, every misaligned attempt at haunting, every flustered apology between them. The mansion's ambient sounds, the soft wind, the creaking floors, distant doors, added a haunting layer to the recordings. Guests leaned forward, curiosity piqued, unaware that the whispers belonged not to phantoms but to the very children seated before them. The crescendo approached. Video clips from the documentary crew played on a secondary screen, capturing my children staging minor hauntings, and Gerald providing subtle collusion. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered instruction was recorded in high-definition clarity. My children's confidence crumbled with each frame. Gerald's smirk faltered, revealing guilt that could no longer be masked. I stood and addressed the room, voice calm yet resonant. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see isn't fiction. It's the story of deceit, collusion, and a staged haunting designed to manipulate, frighten, and attempt to claim what was never yours to take." I gestured toward the screens, where every piece of evidence, from invoices to timestamps, from audio whispers to video recordings, was displayed sequentially. Alice stood beside me, her presence reinforcing the moral clarity of the moment. Every shadow, every flicker, every whispered line, she said, was captured. The hoax was theirs. The evidence is irrefutable. Guests gasped softly, some murmuring in disbelief. My children sat frozen, the weight of exposure pressing down on them. Their carefully rehearsed confidence had evaporated, replaced by raw fear. The mansion itself seemed to respond. A chandelier swayed slightly, floorboards groaned under invisible pressure, and a faint whisper captured and amplified through speakers echoed through the hall. The cinematic tension was perfect. Shadows danced unnaturally across walls, reflections shimmered across polished floors, and even the faintest creak from the east wing was synchronized with the projected evidence. My eldest finally spoke, voice trembling. Dad. But words failed him. Every line of defense had been dismantled by documented evidence. Gerald attempted to intervene, gesturing toward my children as if to explain, but Alice immediately highlighted his own collusion with timestamps and photographs. His face paled. Guests watched silently, captivated. Every invoice, every recording, every time-stamped misstep was displayed with precision. Minor early successes that had made the children feel invincible now emphasized their complete culpability. Their staged hauntings were no longer tricks. They were admissions captured in a mosaic of irrefutable proof. I allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of exposure settle. Silence fell, broken only by the mansion's ambient echoes. The wind rattling a distant window, a candle flickering unpredictably, the faint creak of a floorboard. The tension was almost unbearable, yet perfectly orchestrated. Alice's calm presence beside me reminded me that this was not cruelty. It was justice. Finally, I addressed my children directly, voice steady but firm. You attempted to manipulate me, to frighten me from my own home, to claim what you were never entitled to. Every invoice, every staged whisper, every minor scare you thought clever has been recorded. This mansion, these antiques, this legacy, they were never yours to play with. Their silence was deafening. Gerald, now clearly exposed, could not speak. The documentary footage continued to play, amplifying every minor error, every whispered instruction, every moment of collusion. The gala guests were witnesses to a betrayal now transformed into justice. Alice and I concluded the presentation with the final sequence, side-by-side comparisons of the children's staged hauntings against timestamps, invoices, and audio evidence of Gerald's interference. Every detail meticulously aligned. Guests whispered among themselves, eyes wide with disbelief. My children, trapped in their own web, finally comprehended the magnitude of their exposure. The evening ended not in chaos, but in moral clarity. Justice had been served without cruelty. The mansion, my legacy, and the truth were preserved. The children's fear was real, not of ghosts, but of exposure and accountability. Gerald slunk quietly from the hall, his complicity permanently documented. As I walked through the mansion alone later that night, the soft spring wind rattling windows, candlelight flickering across polished floors, I whispered to myself. They thought the performance was theirs, but the script was always mine. Every shadow, every whisper, every mistake, they wrote their own confession. Alice joined me silently, her calm presence grounding. It's done, she said softly. Every piece is documented, every betrayal recorded. Justice without cruelty. I nodded, savoring the moment. The mansion, the shadows, the whispers, all bore witness to a meticulously orchestrated moral victory. March 23rd ended with the mansion steeped in silent satisfaction. The spring gala had revealed the truth, not through spectacle or drama, but through methodical patience, careful documentation, and moral clarity. My children and Gerald had been exposed, yet the mansion, my legacy, and the truth remained intact. The silence that followed was heavier than any ghost. They had been unmasked, and the weight of exposure hung in every corner. March 24th, 2022. The mansion felt different after the spring gala. Every hallway, every polished floorboard, every antique seemed imbued with the quiet resonance of justice. My children no longer moved with the confident swagger of orchestrators. They moved cautiously, aware that every glance, every breath, every action could now be traced back to the evening of their exposure. Alice and I began the careful work of legal validation. The estate lawyer reviewed every invoice, every timestamp, every hidden camera recording, and every note of Gerald's interference. Each piece aligned with precision, forming a meticulously documented case. Fraudulent contracts were immediately declared void, and any attempts by my children to contest the documentation were rendered meaningless by the weight of indisputable evidence. The mansion itself seemed to echo the fall of betrayal. The faint creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind through partially open windows, and the shadows stretching long across corridors were no longer threats. They were reminders. Each step my children took now carried the knowledge that exposure had become permanent. I reviewed the financial evidence one more time. Invoices totaling $12,400, receipts for props, payments to the fake ghost hunting company, and minor expenditures by the children, all precisely aligned with documented timestamps from March 1st through March 23rd. Every attempt to stage fear, every small misstep, every interference by Gerald was now woven into a coherent, irrefutable record. Gerald's own downfall was equally methodical. The notes he had handed to my children, once subtle and seemingly helpful, had been catalogued, photographed, and time-stamped. Each instance of collusion was highlighted and validated by our lawyer. By March 25th, Gerald understood that the mansion was no longer just a home. It was a meticulously documented archive of every betrayal and every minor success he had attempted to influence. The children were now subdued, their arrogance replaced with the weight of accountability. Conversations that had once been whispers of triumph were now confessions of panic. I overheard one say, "We didn't think he'd catch everything." Another muttered, "It wasn't supposed to end like this." The irony was perfect. Their own miscalculations had been captured, catalogued, and transformed into undeniable evidence. Alice and I catalogued every detail: March 24th, financial validation; March 25th, cross-reference timestamps; March 26th, legal review. Each day reinforced the mansion as a fortress of truth. Every minor scare, every flicker of light, every whispered instruction now served not as a threat to me, but as proof of deception. Visitors to the estate noticed the shift. The mansion, once perceived as a backdrop for minor hauntings, now carried an aura of authority and clarity. My children could no longer manipulate perception. Guests whispered softly about the gala, about the meticulous exposure, and about the calm authority with which the evidence had been presented. The story had become legend in its own right, a narrative of betrayal met with patient moral retribution. I spent hours walking through the corridors, reflecting on the emotional resonance of what had unfolded. Every step reminded me of the patience required to transform fear into justice. Every creak, every flicker, every shadow had been weaponized, not for cruelty, but for clarity. And in that clarity, the mansion, my legacy, and the moral victory were preserved. By March 26th evening, the mansion was quiet. My children and Gerald moved with subdued caution, aware that every action could now be traced. Alice and I reviewed the final evidence package for the lawyer, confirming that every document, every audio clip, and every photograph was accounted for. The estate, the legacy, and the truth were secure. I reflected on the lessons of betrayal and retribution. Revenge, when measured, is not cruelty, it is justice. My children had attempted to manipulate and frighten, but every misstep, every small triumph, every interference had been converted into documented proof of intent. They were left not with shame born of spectacle, but with accountability born of meticulous observation. That night, I walked alone through the grand hallway, the mansion bathed in moonlight. Shadows stretched across antique-laden floors. The wind whispered softly through slightly open windows, and every detail of the betrayal lingered in memory. I whispered softly, "You thought fear could move me, but the only fear that mattered was the fear of truth, and it is yours now." Alice joined me silently, her presence grounding. "The evidence is irrefutable. Every betrayal, every minor scare, every whisper, documented and validated," she said. I nodded, taking a deep breath. The mansion, the legacy, and the moral victory were intact. March 26th ended with a profound sense of closure. The mansion had witnessed betrayal, but it had also witnessed measured justice. Every corner, every shadow, every whisper was now part of an irrefutable record. My children and Gerald had faced exposure, yet the mansion, my legacy, and the truth remained untarnished. The mansion finally exhaled, and with it so did I. Order had been restored not by chaos, but by patience and precision. March 27, 28, 2022. After the spring gala and the meticulous exposure of my children's hoax, the estate settled into a calm that felt almost sacred. The betrayal had left its mark, but the meticulous documentation, careful observation, and strategic orchestration had restored not just my property but my sense of control and moral clarity. Alice and I began securing the estate for long-term protection. Contracts were updated, safe codes reinforced, and key rooms relocked. The lawyer verified that all documents were in order. Invoices, receipts, timestamps, and audio-visual evidence filed both digitally and physically. Any attempt by my children or Gerald to contest or manipulate the evidence would now be legally futile. Walking through the corridors, I noticed how the mansion itself seemed to mirror the restored order. Floorboards, once echoing with anxious whispers and hurried footsteps, now carried only measured, deliberate steps. Shadows no longer concealed deception, they stretched naturally under the evening sun, highlighting the polished wood and the gleaming antiques. Each painting, each artifact, each heirloom reflected the careful restoration of control. March 27th, afternoon. I reviewed the estate ledger with Alice. We cross-referenced every financial document, ensuring the trail of evidence from March 1st through March 23rd was complete. Each invoice, receipt, and payment aligned with documented events. Minor errors that had once made my children feel confident were now irrefutable proof of intent, creating an airtight record for the estate's protection. Even Gerald, the house manager, moved cautiously now. His complicity had been exposed, and while he remained on the estate temporarily, every gesture, every instruction, every glance was now measured, recorded, and catalogued. Trust had been shattered, but accountability had been established. That evening I walked into the grand dining hall, the room still arranged as it had been for the gala. Candlelight flickered softly across polished floors, shadows stretching naturally along the walls. I paused to take in the space, reflecting on the emotional journey that had brought us here. Betrayal, subtle fear, meticulous observation, patient strategy, and finally moral and legal clarity. Alice appeared beside me, her notebook tucked under her arm. "Everything is secured," she said softly. "The estate, the evidence, the legacy. There's nothing left for them to manipulate." I nodded, feeling a rare sense of satisfaction. The mansion, once a stage for deceit, had become a fortress of truth. March 28th, morning. I conducted a final walkthrough, inspecting each room, each hallway, each key piece of evidence. Hidden cameras had been deactivated and stored safely, audio recordings backed up, and receipts filed meticulously. The estate now reflected both order and preparedness, a clear message that any future attempt at manipulation would be met with equally methodical exposure. As I paused near the library, the soft morning light spilling across polished floors, I reflected on the journey. Revenge, when executed with patience and moral clarity, is not about cruelty. It is about restoration. Restoring boundaries, restoring legacy, restoring the truth. Every minor success my children had imagined for themselves had been transformed into evidence of intent, accountability, and exposure. The mansion, my legacy, and the truth were now aligned. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper that had once been a source of tension had been converted into a narrative of justice. The betrayal had been real, but the response had been measured, lawful, and morally grounded. Alice and I sat in the library, reviewing the final dossier one last time. The sequence of events, from initial invoices to subtle collusions, from minor hauntings to the gala reveal, was complete. Every timestamp, every audio clip, every photograph reinforced the narrative of truth over deceit. March 28th, evening. The mansion was silent, save for the soft rustle of leaves outside and the gentle tick of the grandfather clock. I walked the grand hallway one last time for the day, reflecting on the lessons embedded in the betrayal. Patience, observation, and moral clarity had guided every step. Justice had been delivered not with cruelty but with strategy. I whispered softly, almost to the mansion itself. Order isn't chaos. Order is patience. Order is truth. And that is now restored. Alice stood beside me, a quiet affirmation that our alliance had been unwavering, our strategy flawless, and our moral compass intact. The mansion exhaled in quiet contentment, and for the first time in weeks I felt the calm that comes from knowing that every corner, every shadow, and every whisper had been accounted for. Betrayal had been met with precision. Deception had been converted into accountability. Fear had been transformed into truth. March 28th ended with the estate fully secured, the children and Gerald aware of their exposure, and the mansion my sanctuary, my legacy restored to its rightful order. Every element, from evidence to atmosphere, from shadows to candlelight, bore witness to a strategy executed with precision, patience, and unwavering moral clarity. The mansion had returned to silence, yet in that quiet I could hear every lesson, every betrayal, and every step of justice that had unfolded. March 29th, 2022. Alone in the library, I sat with a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the last light of the setting sun. The mansion, now calm, seemed almost to breathe in relief alongside me. The spring gala, the meticulous documentation, and the exposure of my children's hoax had all passed. Yet in the quiet, I could feel the weight of weeks of observation, patience, and strategic orchestration lingering in every corridor and hallway. Walking slowly through the mansion, I noticed the soft creaks of the polished floors beneath my feet, an echo of all the whispers that had once filled these halls. Each artifact, each antique, every heirloom once threatened by deception now seemed to stand as silent witnesses to the moral clarity that had been restored. The Fabergé eggs, the paintings, the silverware, they reflected not just light but the painstaking care with which justice had been executed. I paused near the grand staircase, recalling the first whisper of betrayal back in early March. That crumpled invoice, $12,400 paid to a fake ghost hunting company, had been the opening of a meticulously orchestrated symphony. From minor flickering lights to subtle collusion, each act had been recorded, catalogued, and aligned with unwavering precision. My children, in their overconfidence, had unknowingly provided every thread that had woven the tapestry of their own exposure. Alice entered silently, carrying the final notebooks and backup files. "Everything is documented," she said softly. "The mansion, the evidence, the legacy secure." I nodded, sipping my whiskey slowly. The moral victory was complete. Justice had been delivered not with cruelty, but with measured patience, careful observation, and an unwavering adherence to principle. I wandered past the conservatory, recalling the faint echo of whispered instructions, the misaligned candlelight, and the subtle interference of Gerald, all captured and catalogued. Each creak, each shadow, each flicker of candlelight had been converted into evidence. And now in the silence the mansion itself seemed to affirm the triumph of truth over deception. March 29th, afternoon, I reviewed the final archive one last time. Audio files, video recordings, timestamps, invoices, receipts, and photographs. Every minor detail meticulously cross-referenced. Every subtle misstep by my children, every whispered instruction by Gerald, every staged scare was now a permanent record. The estate, my legacy, and the moral clarity of the operation were unassailable. I paused in the library doorway, looking down the grand hallway. Shadows stretched naturally across polished floors. Wind whispered softly through the slightly open windows, carrying the faint scent of spring. In that quiet, I reflected on the lessons embedded in the betrayal. Patience, meticulous observation, and moral clarity had guided every step. Revenge, executed with precision, had transformed fear into accountability. Alice approached, standing beside me silently. "It's done," she said. "Every betrayal, every minor scare, every shadow, every whisper accounted for." I nodded, feeling a profound sense of closure. The mansion, my sanctuary and legacy, had been restored. Every corner, every artifact, every shadow bore witness to justice delivered without cruelty. March 29th evening brought a deep, satisfying stillness. I walked through the corridors once more, listening to the mansion's soft echoes, the gentle creak of floorboards, the faint rustle of leaves outside, the soft tick of the grandfather clock. Each sound seemed to resonate with the careful orchestration of the past weeks, every whisper and shadow now part of an enduring narrative of moral and legal clarity. I paused at the grand staircase one final time, recalling the whispered instructions, minor mistakes, and subtle collusions that had led to this moment. I raised my glass, speaking softly, almost to the mansion itself. You didn't lose me, you gave me away. The words lingered in the air, a quiet affirmation of the justice that had been achieved. Alice stood beside me, her calm presence grounding. The estate, the legacy, the moral victory, all intact, she said. I nodded, feeling the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. The mansion was silent, yet every shadow, every whisper, every minor flicker of light bore witness to a story of betrayal, strategy, and ultimately, justice. March 29th ended with the mansion steeped in quiet triumph. The children and Gerald had faced exposure. The estate, my legacy, and the truth were preserved, and in the stillness I realized that the most profound victories are not loud. They are measured, patient, and executed with unwavering moral clarity. The mansion had returned to its natural rhythm, a sanctuary of proof, justice, and restored order. Betrayal teaches in silence, and the shadows often carry the clearest lessons. March 30th, 2022. The mansion had settled into a rhythm of calm that felt almost sacred. The echoes of past whispers, creaking floors, and flickering candles lingered only in memory. Alice and I spent the day cataloging the lessons embedded in the chaos, lessons that went far beyond invoices, audio recordings, or staged hauntings. This was about patience, strategy, and moral clarity. I began by walking through the grand hall, touching the polished banister with quiet reverence. Every corner, every artifact, every shadow had played a role in revealing truth. The minor missteps of my children, the subtle interference of Gerald, even the mansion's natural quirks, the drafts, the creaks, the reflections of candlelight, had been part of a perfectly orchestrated story of exposure. Each lesson was embedded in the environment itself, waiting for the observant to see. Alice and I reviewed the evidence one final time, not for legal reasons, but for reflection. It's incredible, she said softly. Every small detail, the wax stains, misaligned shadows, whispered instructions, they all built toward the same truth. Patience was the key. I nodded, sipping coffee, realizing that the real power of strategy isn't in confrontation, it's in observation, in letting time and circumstance reveal the truth. The children, now subdued, were learning lessons the hard way. Exposure had stripped away their arrogance, replaced by accountability. They began to understand that every action carries consequence, that deception, even when disguised as fun or fear, leaves traces. Every minor victory they believed they had achieved now served as documented proof of intent. The mansion had become the ultimate teacher, silently demonstrating the principles of cause and effect. March 30th afternoon, I walked through the conservatory, reflecting on the delicate orchestration of the past weeks. Minor candles, small props, and subtle audio effects had been transformed into a narrative that was both cinematic and moral. The mansion itself had taught me the power of patience and observation, and now it stood as a monument to careful, deliberate justice. Alice placed the final printed documents into labeled folders. These are more than evidence, she said. They're lessons for them, for us, and for anyone who might think deception goes unnoticed. I smiled quietly. Justice had been delivered without cruelty, but with profound moral clarity. The estate, my legacy, and the story itself had become a teaching tool, an example of how measured strategy transforms betrayal into accountability. I paused near the library, looking at the grand piano where my late wife's hands had once rested. Every betrayal leaves a mark, I whispered softly. But it's what you do with the knowledge that defines you. The mansion filled with silent witnesses, antiques, shadows, and the soft echo of past whispers seemed to nod in agreement. March 30th evening, we walked through the East Wing together, cataloging final lessons for posterity. Patience had revealed deceit. Observation had converted fear into evidence. Moral clarity had ensured justice without cruelty. Alice's presence reinforced the importance of loyal allies, someone who can see clearly when emotions run high, someone who can translate observation into action without judgment clouding the process. We reflected on the mansion as a teacher. It had silently guided us, every misaligned candle, every faint whisper, every shadow falling where it shouldn't had contributed to a larger understanding, not just of deception, but of human nature. Betrayal, I realized, is often predictable. It leaves traces. It builds patterns. And it can be observed, documented, and understood if one has patience and moral clarity. As the sun set, painting the polished floors in gold and amber, I whispered quietly to the mansion itself. These walls have witnessed fear, manipulation, and missteps. But they've also witnessed clarity, justice, and patience. And those are lessons worth remembering. Alice nodded silently, understanding the weight of the moment. March 30th ended with a sense of reflection and closure. The mansion, once a stage of deceit, now stood as a repository of lessons. My children and Gerald had been exposed, yet the focus was no longer on punishment, but on understanding cause, consequence, and moral boundaries. The mansion, my legacy, and the careful orchestration of justice had become a story of shadows, patience, and truth. And in the quiet, I understood a simple truth. Betrayal is loud in its deception, but it is the calm, patient observer who learns its deepest lessons. Ghosts were never real, but the fear of exposure, that was absolute. March 31st, 2022. The mansion had returned to its natural rhythm. The echoes of creaking floorboards, flickering candles, and whispered lines were now memories rather than active tension. My children and Gerald had sent their hollow apologies, formal, hesitant, devoid of sincerity, but the message was clear. They had been seen, their deception exposed, and their attempt at manipulation had failed. Alice and I sat in the library reviewing the final correspondence. Letters and emails from my children read like muted confessions. We're sorry for the trouble caused. We didn't realize how serious this would be. We understand your position. Gerald's note was similarly perfunctory, acknowledging his involvement but offering no excuses. These were apologies, yes, but hollow ones, lacking acknowledgement of the moral lessons that had been carefully documented and enforced. I walked through the corridors, the mansion bathed in the soft morning light of early spring. The polished floors reflected the sun, shadows stretched naturally, and the air felt calm for the first time in weeks. I paused near the grand staircase, reflecting on how far we had come. The invoices, the hidden recordings, the timestamps, the financial evidence, the minor missteps, and Gerald's subtle collusion, all of it had converged into a single truth. Betrayal cannot hide from observation. Alice appeared beside me, quietly noting the final details in her notebook. The ghosts they imagined, she said softly, were never real. The real fear was exposure, and that fear is the only thing they truly felt. I nodded. She was right. Every staged flicker, every whisper, every misaligned prop had been orchestrated not to frighten me, but to build a perfect record of intent. The only haunting that mattered was the haunting of their own actions laid bare. March 31st afternoon, I walked through the East Wing once more, observing the minor traces of the children's hoax. The slightly tilted candles, the faint wax stains, the shadows they had manipulated. Each one was now frozen in time, photographed, time-stamped, and catalogued. The mansion itself had become a museum of lessons, deception laid bare, mistakes preserved, moral clarity reinforced. I reflected on the process, on how revenge had been executed with precision, patience, and ethical restraint. Every step had been lawful, every observation meticulous, every exposure undeniable. Justice had been delivered without cruelty, allowing the mansion, the legacy, and the truth to remain intact. The children had been taught the hard way that deception leaves traces, that manipulation is visible to the patient observer, and that accountability is inevitable. Alice and I paused near the conservatory where one of the minor orb illusions had once been staged. The faint sunlight caught the polished floors, highlighting the misaligned shadows that had once terrified them. "It's done," she said. "Every betrayal accounted for, every misstep recorded. The mansion, your legacy. The truth, all intact. I raised my glass of whiskey and nodded. In that quiet, I finally allowed myself a small smile. Revenge is rarely about spectacle. It is about clarity, measured response, and moral justice. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker had been leveraged not to punish, but to illuminate truth. The mansion had borne witness to betrayal, fear, and ultimately accountability. I walked through the library one last time, tracing the spines of leather-bound volumes with my fingers. I paused, looking at the grand piano where my late wife's hands had once rested. I whispered softly, almost to the walls themselves. The ghosts were never real. The fear, the deceit, the exposure that was the true haunting. And now, it is gone. March 31st ended with the mansion silent, the estate fully secured, and the lessons indelibly etched in every corner. My children and Gerald had sent their hollow apologies, but their fear of exposure remained their most profound lesson. The mansion, my legacy, and the truth were intact. And in that silence, I realized a final truth. Ghosts may never walk these halls, but the evidence of one's own actions can haunt endlessly.